The summer air in Colfax, Louisiana hung thick as molasses, and the revival tent buzzed with an energy that made my skin tingle. I'd driven 3 hours from Shreveport, drawn by something I couldn't name, a restlessness that had been building in my chest for months. My name is Thaddeus Broussard, and at 26, I thought I knew exactly who I was supposed to be. Bank teller by day, dutiful son by night, sitting in the same pew at St. Mary's every Sunday since I could remember. But lately, that life felt like clothes that didn't fit anymore. The preacher that night wasn't like the buttoned-up ministers I was used to. Reverend Zephyr Caldwell moved across the makeshift stage like he was dancing with invisible partners, his voice rising and falling like music. He had wild honey-colored hair that caught the tent lights. And when he spoke about finding truth in unexpected places, his dark eyes seemed to look straight through me. "The Spirit moves where it will," he called out, his voice carrying over the crowd. "It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't follow our rules. It just moves." Something about the way he said it made my heart race. When he asked for volunteers to come forward for prayer, I found myself standing before I'd made the conscious decision to move. "What's your name, brother?" he asked when I reached the front, his voice soft now, meant just for me. "Thaddeus," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Thaddeus." He said it like he was tasting something sweet. "What are you seeking tonight?" I opened my mouth to give him the safe answer. Blessings, guidance, the usual things people ask for. But when I looked into his eyes, all I could think was, "You. I'm seeking you." Instead, I said, "I don't know anymore." His smile was gentle, understanding. Sometimes not knowing is the first step toward finding everything. When he placed his hands on my shoulders to pray, I felt something shift inside me. Not the theatrical swooning I'd seen at other revivals, but something deeper. Like a door had opened in a room I'd kept locked my whole life. After the service, I lingered by my car in the gravel parking lot, not ready to drive back to my empty apartment and pretend this night had never happened. The tent was being broken down around us, but I couldn't seem to make myself leave. "Thaddeus." I turned to find Zephyr walking toward me, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that made my mouth go dry. Up close, away from the stage lights, he looked younger, maybe only a few years older than me. "I was hoping you'd still be here," he said, stopping close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with honest sweat. "Would you like to get some coffee? I know it's late, but I'm too wound up to sleep." We ended up at an all-night diner on the outskirts of town, sitting across from each other in a red vinyl booth that had seen better decades. The fluorescent lights should have been harsh, unflattering, but somehow they just made the angles of his face more interesting. "So," he said, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup, "what's a banker from Shreveport doing at a revival in Colfax?" "How did you know I'm a banker?" "The way you carry yourself. The careful way you speak. You've been taught to be cautious, haven't you?" I stirred sugar into my coffee, buying time. "My whole life. And is that working for you?" The question hung between us like a challenge. In the distance, a semi-truck rumbled past on the highway, its headlights sweeping across the windows. "No," I said finally. "It's not. What would you do if you weren't being careful?" The honest answer sat on my tongue like fire. I'd reach across this table and touch his hand. I'd tell him that I'd spent the entire service watching the way he moved, the way his voice wrapped around words like a caress. I'd admit that I'd never felt about anyone the way I felt about him after knowing him for all of 3 hours. I don't know, I lied. But when he smiled, I knew he saw right through me. "I'm traveling through Mississippi next week," he said. "There's a camp meeting in Tupelo. You should come. I work. Take a day off, Thaddeus. Live a little." The way he said my name made something flutter in my chest. "Why?" "Because I have the feeling you've been sleepwalking through your life, and I'd like to be there when you wake up." I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years and drove to Tupelo with my heart hammering against my ribs. The camp meeting was smaller than the revival in Colfax, held in a grove of oak trees behind a country church. Maybe 50 people scattered on folding chairs and blankets, fireflies beginning to blink in the gathering dusk. Zephyr found me before the service started, appearing at my elbow like he'd been watching for me. "You came," he said, and the relief in his voice made me wonder if he'd been as nervous as I was. "I came." This time, when he preached about surrendering to what moves you, I felt like he was speaking directly to me. His eyes kept finding mine across the small crowd, and each time they did, I felt a pull in my chest like being called home. After the service, as people were dispersing into the warm night, he caught my arm. "Walk with me." We followed a path that led away from the church, through the trees to a small pond that reflected the stars like scattered diamonds. The air was full of the sound of crickets and the distant murmur of voices from the camp. "Tell me about your life in Shreveport," he said, settling on a fallen log near the water's edge. I sat beside him, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. "It's not much to tell. I go to work, I go home, I go to church. I have dinner with my parents on Sundays. I'm lonely." The word hit me like a punch. "How did you know?" "Because I was lonely too for a long time, until I learned to stop running from who I really was." "And who are you really?" He turned to look at me, and in the moonlight, his face was soft and serious. "I'm a man who believes that love is the truest form of worship. I'm someone who thinks that denying who you are is the worst kind of sin." My breath caught. "Zephyr, I know what you're feeling, Thaddeus. I've been feeling it too, since the moment I saw you walk into that tent." When he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. His fingers were warm, slightly rough from years of travel and manual labor. The touch sent electricity up my arm and straight to my heart. I started, then stopped. "Never what?" "Never felt this way about anyone. Never wanted anyone the way I want you." He squeezed my hand gently. "Were you afraid of?" "Everything. My family, my job, my church. What people will think. What means about me. What it means about you is that you're human. That you're capable of love. That's something to celebrate, not fear." When he leaned in to kiss me, soft and tentative under the Louisiana stars, I felt like I was finally breathing for the first time in my life. We spent the rest of the week together, and with each passing day, I felt myself becoming more real. Zephyr had rented a small cabin outside of town, and I found myself there every evening after he finished his ministerial duties. "The spirit is moving," he said one night as we sat on the porch swing, my head on his shoulder, his fingers running through my hair. "I can feel it." "Where is it moving?" "Through you. Through me. Through this thing between us." I lifted my head to look at him. "Is that what this is?" "The spirit. Love is the spirit, Thaddeus. The truest, purest form of it. Anyone who tells you different is lying." Inside the cabin, he lit candles and played soft music on an old guitar he'd found in a pawn shop. When he sang, his voice was different than it was in the pulpit, softer, more intimate, like he was sharing secrets. "Dance with me," he said, setting the guitar aside. "I don't know how. Neither do I. Let's figure it out together." We moved together in the flickering candlelight, awkward at first, then finding our rhythm. His hands on my waist, my arms around his neck, the whole world narrowed down to just this moment, just us. "I love you," I whispered against his ear, the words coming out before I could stop them. He pulled back to look at me, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I love you too." When he kissed me then, it was deeper than before, full of promise and possibility. I felt myself melting into him, all the careful walls I'd built around my heart crumbling like paper. "Are you sure?" he asked when we broke apart, both of us breathing hard. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." He took my hand and led me to the bedroom, where moonlight streamed through the windows and lay across the simple bed like a blessing. What happened in that room was sacred in a way that had nothing to do with the churches I'd known all my life. Zephyr touched me like I was something precious, like I was a prayer he'd been waiting his whole life to speak. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his hands tracing the lines of my face in the moonlight. "Do you know that?" I never thought of myself as beautiful, but the way he looked at me made me believe it might be true. He moved over me with a reverence that made my breath catch, his body strong and warm against mine. When he whispered my name like a benediction, I understood for the first time what people meant when they talked about religious ecstasy. The Spirit is moving, he said, his voice rough with emotion, his hips moving against mine in a rhythm that felt older than time. I couldn't speak, could only hold on to him as he moved, as we moved together, as something built between us that felt like standing at the edge of something vast and wonderful. When it was over, we lay tangled together in the sheets, my head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. Outside, the night sounds of rural Mississippi continued their ancient symphony. What happens now? I asked, my voice small in the darkness. Now we figure out how to build a life together, he said, his arms tightening around me. If that's what you want. It's what I want, I said without hesitation. It's all I want. The next morning, I called my bank and requested a leave of absence. I called my parents and told them I needed some time to figure things out. I didn't tell them about Zephyr, not yet, but I think my mother heard something different in my voice. You sound happy, Cher, she said, using the childhood nickname she'd called me since I was small. Really happy. I am, Mama. For the first time in a long time, I really am. Zephyr and I spent the day walking through the countryside, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his childhood in Arkansas, about the seminary he'd attended, and then left when he realized that the institutional church couldn't contain the kind of spirituality he felt called to. I've been traveling for 5 years, he said as we sat by a creek, our feet dangling in the cool water, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. But with you. What? With you, I want to try staying still for a while. That evening, we drove back to Shreveport together, and I felt like I was seeing my hometown for the first time. The familiar streets looked different somehow, full of possibility instead of limitation. Are you nervous? Zephyr asked as we pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex. Terrified, I admitted, but also excited. Is that weird? No, he said, leaning over to kiss me softly. It's perfect. Introducing Zephyr to my life was like learning to breathe underwater, difficult at first, then natural. My neighbors were curious about the handsome preacher who'd moved into my spare bedroom. My coworkers noticed the new lightness in my step, the way I hummed while I worked. My parents were the hardest part. I brought Zephyr to Sunday dinner 3 weeks after he'd moved in, and the tension around the table was thick enough to cut with a knife. So, Reverend Caldwell, my father said, his voice carefully neutral, what denomination are you affiliated with? I'm non-denominational, sir. I believe that the Spirit moves beyond the boundaries of any one church. My mother, bless her heart, had been watching the way Zephyr and I looked at each other, the careful way we avoided sitting too close or touching in front of them. Finally, she set down her fork and looked at me directly. Thaddeus, are you happy? Yes, ma'am. Happier than I've ever been. That's all that matters to me. My father took longer to come around, but when he did, it was with the quiet acceptance that had always been his way. I don't pretend to understand everything, he told me one evening when we were alone, but I can see that you're different, better. And if this young man is responsible for that, then I reckon he's all right by me. 6 months later, Zephyr and I were married in a small ceremony in the backyard of our new house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't legal in the eyes of the state, but it was blessed by friends who had become family and witnessed by a God who I'd learned was bigger and more loving than I'd ever imagined. The night of our wedding, we lay in our bed in our house and the life we'd built together, and I marveled at how far I'd traveled from that scared man in the revival tent. Do you ever regret it? I asked, my fingers tracing patterns on his chest. Giving up the traveling life? Never, he said without hesitation. I spent 5 years looking for home, and I found it in you. The Spirit moved, didn't it? Oh, it moved, he said, rolling over to look at me, his eyes bright with love and mischief. And it's still moving. He kissed me then, deep and slow, his body settling over mine with the familiarity of countless nights and the excitement of countless more to come. When he moved against me, I felt that same sacred electricity I'd felt the first night we'd made love, that sense of being part of something larger than ourselves. "I love you," he whispered against my lips, his hips moving in that rhythm that had become our own private prayer. "I love you too," I whispered back, and meant it with every fiber of my being. Outside, the Louisiana night sang its ancient song, and inside our little house we created our own music, a harmony of sighs and whispers, of bodies moving together in perfect sync, of two souls that had found their match. When the spirit moves, it doesn't ask permission. It doesn't follow rules. It just moves, carrying you toward love, toward truth, toward the person you were always meant to be. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it moves you straight into the arms of the person you were always meant to love.